For our next example, we want to find the sine of 7 pi over 6, the cosine of 7 pi over 6, and the tangent of 7 pi over 6. So if we follow the steps that we talked about, the first step is to figure out what quadrant 7 pi over 6 lands in. So if I go halfway around the unit circle, this would take me to 6 pi over 6, because if I then reduce that, that would just be pi, and I know that pi lands right at the 180 degree mark. 7 pi over 6 should be just a little bit further than that, so I know that I'm actually down in this quadrant. This is 7 pi over 6. So I'm in the quadrant where only the tangents are positive. So that's going to be important when I go to give my answer, to keep in mind that my sine and my cosine should both be negative. Next thing I want to do is figure out my reference angle. These are all coming from the pi over 6 reference angle in the first quadrant. So pi over 6, the ordered pair that we get for pi over 6, I know the first thing is supposed to be a cosine, the second thing is supposed to be a sine. So this is root 3 over 2, comma 1/2. So I'm going to use those values. The first thing is going to be the cosine value. Second thing is going to be the sine value. So the sine of 7 pi over 6, because I'm landing in the third quadrant where sines and cosines are both negative, it's going to be negative, and then you look at what the sine value is for the reference angle. So it's going to be negative 1/2. For cosine, I know this one also needs to be negative because I landed in the quadrant where only tangents are positive. So it's going to be negative, and then you're looking at your reference angle's value. The cosine is root 3 over 2. And finally, your tangent. Here is an identity we probably haven't talked about yet. The sine of theta divided by the cosine of theta is equal to the tangent of theta. So with that information, because I already have the sine and I already have the cosine, I can figure out what the tangent is supposed to be. So the tangent of 7 pi over 6 should be what the sine of 7 pi over 6 is, which is negative 1/2, divided by the cosine of 7 pi over 6, which we said is negative root 3 over 2. So we are dividing fractions. That's the same thing as multiplying by the reciprocal of that bottom fraction. So it's going to be negative 1/2 times negative 2 over root 3. And we can cross cancel out those 2's. This is a negative times a negative, which is going to be a positive value. So we're going to get 1 in the top and root 3 in the bottom. So our tangent of 7 pi over 6 is positive 1 over root 3. You could also rationalize that denominator if you want. So another answer you could write if you rationalize the denominator is root 3 divided by 3. Those are equivalent answers. Let's do another one. We want to find the secant of 3 pi over 4. So secant, if you recall, secant of theta is equal to 1 over whatever the cosine of theta is. So I'm going to figure out what quadrant 3 pi over 4 lands in. If I go all the way over to this point, this would be 4 pi over 4. I know that because pi should land at that point and 4 over 4 cancels. That's a little too far. So 3 pi over 4 should be in the second quadrant. And in the second quadrant, only the sines are supposed to be positive. And since secant is 1 over the cosine, that means that secant should also be a negative answer. So whatever pops out, I should get a negative number. Next step is to look at the reference angle. This is a pi over 4 reference angle. And we know that the pi over 4 ordered pair is root 2 over 2, comma root 2 over 2. So both the sine and the cosine are root 2 over 2 for pi over 4. So to do secant of 3 pi over 4, I need 1 over the cosine of 3 pi over 4. which is going to be a negative number. So I'm using the reference angle. The first thing is always the cosine, and I know it needs to be negative. So it's going to be 1 over negative root 2 over 2, which means that it's going to be 1 times the reciprocal, 2 over root 2, with a negative sign tagged on. So my final answer here for the secant of 3 pi over 4 needs to be negative 2 over root 2, or you're allowed to rationalize that denominator if you want. That would give you negative 2 root 2 over 2 if you rationalized it, and those would cancel. So it could simplify to negative square root of 2. I'm okay if you leave your answer without being rationalized, or I'm also okay if you leave your answer as negative square root of 2.